So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research.
We're living on a disk, floating through space, with a tiny sun.
Hey, I'm FTFE. Welcome back to the FTFE show. This is day 20 of Stream Every Day for a month, and I miss sleep. Today we're not doing Flat Earth, so you might not need your facepalm protection. We'll see how it goes. We're going to have a civilized discussion between a dinosaur that says the Earth is billions of years old and someone who's amazing at debunking Flat Earth that is a young Earth creationist, which is going to be very interesting. I'd like to welcome to the show, welcome back to the show, Dapper Dino. And our young Earth creationist for today, Peter. I always get your name, say it wrong. Markley, right?
Yes, that's right.
Markley, yes. I've got a friend with a surname of Markey, and I just always want to say that instead. Thank you guys.
Hey,
for
at least
on.
it's not malarkey, like Nathan Thompson was saying.
Well, it's all right. At least when you debated Nathan Thompson, he didn't just like beat a duck with a hammer instead of talking to you. Because that's how my debate on Modern Day Debate went with him. Dapper, how you doing, mate? Welcome back.
Oh, I'm doing all right. It's nice to be back, especially so soon. It's only been, what, 2 days?
Yeah, not enough time for you to get your human suit dry cleaned, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, that's why I'm back in just my regular old me. So this is me on camera in my regular, real body, you know.
Yeah, yes. He talks telepathically, just in case you're wondering why the mouth doesn't move.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, you wouldn't understand, puny humans.
It's a secret.
And I just want to let everyone know, unfortunately, I will not be doing Star Trek this Friday, as I'm a dumbass and double booked myself. I agreed a while ago to debate about the final experiment on Modern Day Debate this Friday. So I will be, unfortunately, leaving my ship without a chief engineer. If I come back and there's any changes to the engine room, I am moving all of your bunks to the waste pipe department. Do not mess with the engineer, okay? Right, today we're going to have a discussion about the age of the Earth. And we're going to start with Peter. We're going to let Peter introduce himself, let you know who he is, and explain his position on the age of the Earth and why he thinks it is that, and then we can just go into open discussion between him and Dapper. Hopefully I won't need to do much moderating, as these are both sensible people. In fact, this is how sensible they are. I send the link to the streams that I do relatively early, usually a half hour to 45 minutes before. And that's because having a flat earther click a link is hard. You know, I have to explain to them how to click the link in the email, and then the fact they haven't downloaded Zoom and they need to do that, and then how to join the Zoom call, and the fact that, no, they don't need to put in a password, it's fine. And then I have to explain to them they haven't turned their camera and mic on. Then I have to explain to them that they're probably facing the wrong way and forgot to get dressed. And that process usually takes a while. Within 3 minutes of me sending the link, both of these gentlemen were in the chat. I was very confused. That's not how this goes.
Wait, hold on. Was I supposed to have pants on for this?
No, you're okay. You're a dinosaur. Just the tie. Is,
oh, okay. I just...
From what I understand,
yeah, okay. I was about to panic. I was like, oh no.
From what I understand, going to the British Museum, dinosaurs just wear top hats, monocles, and ties. That's normal, right?
Yeah. Every once in a while, someone will mix it up with, like, you know, actual bifocal glasses or like a bowler hat or something. But yeah, pretty much top hats, monocles, and ties.
Yeah. And just for the audience, what type of dinosaur are you?
I am a Ceratosaurus nasicornis.
Ah, and how old are you?
Or Ceratosaurus, if you just want the genes. I'm about 150 million years old. It's hard to say exactly because, you know, after such a long time, it's hard to keep track of the exact number of years. But yeah, about 150 million.
It's going to be interesting because I think Peter may have some issues with that. So Peter, over to you. Why don't you take the floor, introduce yourself, and explain your position on the Earth for us?
All right, well, I was raised as a fundamentalist Christian. I still am a fundamentalist Christian in many ways, but in the last 8 years, I feel like there have been a lot of sociological changes to the scene in this country. And so I've been kicked out of many former communities of like, you know, conservative Christians, and now I'm frequently called a liberal by people who anyway, the point is though, I I still believe in the Bible. I still believe every word is inspired by God. And that for that reason, I don't believe in evolution because I believe Genesis is literal history. But obviously, the Bible does not say the Earth is flat, and so that leaves room for scientific inquiry on that question. And obviously, NASA has photos. It's a sphere. So I don't know. I grew up kind of with my personal mission of wanting to help society take young Earth creationism more seriously, so that people could see, oh, you can be a young Earth creationist and not a complete idiot. That was my personal mission when I was a kid. And then Flat Earth came along, and it's like, oh, darn. That just kind of made a big setback in that mission. And so I'm basically on a indefinite side quest of trying to put out that fire, trying to help society, well, trying to help flat earthers stop being flat earthers. I don't know. I'm kind of losing track of what I'm saying here. So I don't have a lot of scientific reasons for my position on the age of the Earth. I used to be more up on that, like when I was a kid, like kind of in more, I guess, like fight mode on it. But obviously, the main reason that I believe in a young Earth is because of the Bible. And because I believe the Bible is a relevant source on that topic, because this is the past that we're talking about. We can't go into space and take a photograph of the origin of life. At least not on this planet. You could argue, like, okay, distant starlight, maybe we can zoom in on a distant exoplanet and watch the origin of life happen there, or, you know, something. But that's all speculation. We don't have that evidence right now. The evidence we have does not include any direct observation of this question. So to me, that leaves room for historical documents like the Bible. And I do take it very seriously. I believe it should have room in the conversation. But I'm not in fight mode about that. Like I learned a lot from flat earthers about what not to do. And just trying to convince other people at any and every opportunity is one of those things that I've learned not to do. So I had a friend encourage me to have this conversation. I don't know that I would have done it otherwise. And I'm told that Dapper Dino is very cordial about it. And you know, Craig is a friend of Michael Toons, and anybody who's a friend of Michael Toons is friendly in my mind. So here I am.
Well, cool. Thank you. First, I have to say, I don't know what you've been told. I'm actually a raging asshole, and we're going to talk about all this. No, I'm kidding. I'll be nice, I promise. So that was an interesting, and it seemed to me like I probably expected it to be roughly that the Bible is your main reason for accepting the flat Earth, or sorry, the young Earth. That was an honest mistake. So I guess what I would ask is, let's say that you found the Bible saying something that is very obviously not true. Would you reinterpret the Bible? Would you reject the Bible, or would you accept the thing that, at least according to everything we can see, simply isn't true? Like, for instance, if you wanted to take the Bible literally, you would have to assume that the value of pi is in fact 3. Now, I think that it's perfectly reasonable to have an interpretation of that passage to say, well, maybe they're just measuring the outside for the diameter and the inside for the perimeter, and then just be okay with that. But if taken literally, strictly literally, the Bible does indicate that pi is 3. So what's your position on pi? the letter. No, sorry, not the the letter that encodes a number, not the.
Yeah. So obviously pi is an irrational number starting with 3.14159265358979323. The Bible does not give that many significant digits. It only gives one significant digit, and it is still accurate at that significant digit. It's not the purpose of that passage is not to give us a value for pi.
Okay. And you would say that the purpose of Genesis 1 and 2 is to give us a historical account of the origin of the universe?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Does it bug you at all that at the time of the writing of the various parts of Genesis, that the idea of a history, in the sense that we have it modernly, really hadn't been invented yet? And that what we think of as histories at the time were mostly just polemical writings about, like socio-political and religio-political matters, and that it's very clear that much of Genesis was written in direct response to the socio-political situation of exilic Jews in the Babylonian exile and countering the theological claims of the Babylonian priests. Like that, how does that factor into this?
I don't think that's accurate. Genesis was written long before the Babylonian exile.
I mean, it demonstrably wasn't, but that's okay. So I guess what it really comes down to is what takes priority? Does physical reality take priority, or does a text take priority? My contention is always that any text which exists within physical reality must see priority to that physical reality, because it depends on that physical reality to exist in the first place. So, for instance, if there were no universe, or there were a universe that did not have consistent rules, then we would have no reason to think that the Bible could possibly exist. Since the universe does exist and seems to have reasonably consistent rules, and the Bible exists within it, then this measure by which we must decide what's true and not can't primarily be the Bible. It has to be reality. Would you disagree there?
No, obviously, reality is, by definition, what's real. So the Bible is a document that records certain realities that we cannot directly observe.
Okay.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it references certain realities we can find evidence for archaeologically and historically, but it also references some we cannot, and I believe it passes the test of credibility on those topics.
On the topics for which we found positive evidence?
Well, for all topics it addresses, but I was referring specifically to the ones that we cannot find evidence for directly. So, yeah. So what that says to me is that since you would say that physical reality is prior to the Bible, and that if some physical reality contradicted at least your interpretation, that we should favor the evidence of physical reality, right? Because I want to make sure that because if it's just, I will believe my interpretation of the Bible literally no matter the evidence, then there isn't much point in having the discussion, right? Because there's nothing I could present that would constitute evidence. So is that the position you're in vis-a-vis your interpretation of the Bible? I'm sorry, I lost track of exactly what you're...
No worries. So if you were to find physical evidence that contradicted your interpretation of the Bible, at least, would that cause you to reject the physical evidence? Or would it
that would call, if it was undeniable physical evidence, it would call into question my interpretation. Because I think it's, and we do this with any text that we respect, the way to be most fair to a text is to find the most plausible, or the interpretation that agrees the best with all of the other information that we have. So if our friend texts us but has a typo in their text message and we have to figure out or uses a word that's ambiguous, let's say, and there's one interpretation of that text that makes no sense and another interpretation that makes perfect sense, why on earth would we choose the interpretation that makes no sense? And I think the same is true of the Bible. If we find undeniable physical reality that contradicts our interpretation of the Bible, but there's another interpretation we can find that makes good with that reality, then obviously the most fair choice is to assume the Bible author meant the thing that makes sense.
Okay, so what I'm going to go with then is to say that in that case, what we should focus on is primarily on scientific reasons to determine, or scientific ways that we can determine things like age or duration, or maybe putting minimums on certain processes and things like that. Because if it is true that you are willing to change your interpretation of the Bible in the face of evidence that contradicts your previous interpretation, then we don't have to worry too much about the exact text of the Bible, because you're willing to reinterpret it, and I'm perfectly happy to let you do that. So what I would say then,
I will try to caution you that it's not that simple, and I don't know that it makes sense to have, like, it sounds like you have a lot of ambition for this conversation just from the tone, and maybe I'm wrong, but like I don't expect to have my mind changed in this conversation.
I don't expect you to. I'm just wanting to get to a point where we know what we can discuss that is relevant. Because to me, the exact text of, say, Genesis 1 or 2 is not terribly relevant, given that there are scientific aspects to this question.
I do wish, though, we had lingered just a moment longer when you said that it's demonstrably not true that Genesis was written long before the Babylonian exile, because I think there is more to talk about there.
Well, I mean, if you wanted to have a when was Genesis written discussion, we could probably set that up. I don't know if Craig would want to host it. It seems a little pretty far off topic for him, but maybe he would. I don't know. That does seem like it would be a different discussion.
Yeah,
So,
I guess you're right.
I just lost my train of thought a little. Okay, so age of the Earth. So the first thing I want to say is, what do you mean by a direct observation? Because to me, all observations and all measurements are indirect to some degree. I do not have access to primary reality unfiltered by things like my senses and the way that my brain interprets them. So what to you is a direct measurement so that we can try to get past that? Because I do think that we can measure the age of the Earth.
Yeah, and I suppose that one of the strongest evidences is in the category of like radiometric dating, and I will be honest, that is one of the definite weak points in my view. I feel like there are reasons to think it's less reliable than the scientific community.
I don't want to talk about a particular measurement technique right now. I just want to understand what you mean by direct, right? So like, if I take out a tape measure and I measure the length of my desk, is that a direct measurement?
I would say so, yes.
Okay. If instead I take out, say, a theodolite, and I try to use triangulation to measure the width of my desk, is that a direct measurement?
I think I see where you're headed with this, and I think the answer to your larger point here is that yes, the term direct in this case is a little bit subjective. There's perhaps a spectrum, or
so let's just go with measurement then, and we can talk about whether or not we think the measurement is particularly valid. And I don't actually want to start with radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is definitely how we get a nice number that we can slap on the Earth and say, see, this is 3.45 billion or whatever. But one thing to note is that well before radiometric dating, the idea that the Earth was much older than, say, the 6,000 to 10,000 years that most young Earthers think it is, which is, I'm assuming you're somewhere in that range?
Yes.
Okay. That idea was already largely abandoned in academia and geology and physics and whatnot for much more basic reasons. Reasons like just the amount of time it would take for the Earth to look like it does now is too long because of physics. So, for instance, the fastest that we can determine based on physics for things like limestone to deposit, and in this case we're talking about biogenic limestone, which is the vast majority of it, is at about 1 centimeter per millennium. And we have multiple layers of limestone that formed at different times, because they're not the same layer, they're at different parts of the geological column, that are themselves hundreds of meters thick, which means that just for the limestone on Earth to form, under ideal conditions, which means warm, calm water that's slightly but not too acidic, so flood right out, any kind of stormy environment, not going to be the maximum deposition rate, any kind of cold water, not maximum deposition rate. So all those things will push the deposition rate to be longer. So at the minimum, we have hundreds of thousands of years worth of limestone just on Earth. And we don't need radiometric dating. We can measure,
I see.
based on physics, how this works, and we can work it out and say the absolute minimum, just for the limestone, is hundreds of thousands of years, sorry.
Okay, but that's still it like I have to be so careful, and this is one of the reasons why I don't like talking about this in any kind of like debate sense anymore, is because I'm still working through, just personally, what is a tactic that sounds like a flat earther and what is a tactic that is actually rational, you know? It's only been in the last few years that I've really had to see and confront the reality that flat earth, this flat earth movement is, you know, exists, and that there are people like that in our world. And so it's been a very recent thing for me after, like I said, like my entire life being raised as a young earth creationist and starting out in fight mode when I was a young teen and gradually coming to my own conclusions and my own convictions, and then like being confident, but then learning to shut my mouth sometimes, you know, because it's not helpful. And then gradually moving on to other things in life, and then sometimes the things that made me so confident like fading in my memory so that I'm rusty on the topic. And so it's been this whole process, and then just within the last few years for me it's been like, oh gosh, some of those tactics that we were using bear some faint resemblance to these tactics of these complete morons.
I'd say it's more than faint in many cases, but
and so it's like every time I'm having one of these conversations and I start to think of an answer, I have to ask myself, wait, is this answer about to be similar to the kind of answer that a flat earther would give?
Okay,
and
well,
that process is very difficult, and I have not worked through it entirely.
I mean, that's fair, but it does still remain the case that we do not need radiometric dating. We can use very simple, and when I say physics, I mean things like how fast does a small piece of matter fall in water based on things like the force of gravity and the force of Brownian motion and how that relates to the temperature of the water, and how, and with the acidity, that takes into account things like whether or not the limestone is going to dissolve back into the water before it precipitates out. That's why we have the slight acidic conditions. So do you have, and if you've never thought about limestone deposition, that's fine, but do you realize why it would be that people, even Bible-believing Christians, who were the first people to notice things like this, would look out and say, hey, that is like 200 meters of continuous deposition biogenic limestone that could not form in less than several 100,000 years.
Yes, I get the argument, and in my mind, it falls into a category of other similar arguments that I do have what I think is an answer to in my mind. It's convincing to me, but I stopped myself from saying it just now because of that question of, you know, is this anything like what a flat earther would say? Yeah,
we can figure out whether it is like a flat earther. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. I don't know.
Well, that's the thing, is like I can't necessarily, that my process of making that evaluation, that's kind of a personal process. I can't necessarily trust my ideological opponents, no offense, to help me with that process very much. Like, yes, you can certainly offer another view, but that is a personal process for me. And
well, maybe rather than worrying about whether or not it's flat earth-like, do you find that argument to be persuasive at all? And if not, why not?
I don't find it very persuasive, and the reason is, and this goes back to one of the main talking points I've had since I was a kid, that there are certain assumptions that we have to make when we either make that argument or reject that argument. Like, everyone has certain starting assumptions, no matter what. There's no way to avoid that in their worldview. And so one of the starting assumptions that I see in that argument is this process that we observe today and all the factors that go into how that process works today and how long it takes today applies throughout all of time. There are no other factors that we cannot observe today that could have been in effect at some earlier time. And so, like, one of the terms that I would use is like was it a universalist approach versus a catastrophist approach? I'm sure you've probably heard those terms.
Yeah, usually I hear them in terms of uniformitarian versus catastrophism. Okay,
yes, that's actually the correct. That's what I was trying to reach for. See, I'm rusty.
No, it's all right.
Yes, that's what I was trying to reach for.
Okay, so the assumption that is made in studies like this are the assumptions of science, right? So science assumes a few things. One is that the universe operates to principles that are invariant by time and space. So, for instance, the strength of the or the value, say, for big G, the universal gravitational constant, is something that is going to be the same here on Earth as it is on Mars, and equally the same as it is in the Andromeda Galaxy, or even farther at some distant galaxy across the observable universe. And similarly, that things like the fine structure constant, the strength and fall-off rate of both the weak and strong nuclear forces, the strength of the electromagnetic force, the speed of light, that these things are generally going to stay the same, no matter where you are. Now, taking into account things like relativistic effects, but for an observer in any given frame of reference, physics will be the same, and that's not going to be temporally invariant. The reason that science makes that is because it's the only way to actually get science done. Because science is based on empiricism, where we gather data, and we say, okay, we gathered this data in the past, and it is going to be relevant to our predictions about future data. The only way for that to logically follow is if the principles according to which the universe operates are time invariant and location invariant. So in order to come up with a counter, you can't simply say, well, you're assuming that the rate is going to be invariant across time, because that's not what's assumed. In fact, what was found is the maximum rate given what we know about physics and chemistry. So if you want to propose an even faster rate, what you have to do is propose new physics or new chemistry that people have not yet discovered. And until you can do that, your argument is just, but what if magic in the past, though? Which you can make as an argument, but you can see why that's not going to be
slow down a little bit.
Argument.
Slow down a little bit, because it doesn't have to be magic. Just because we haven't discovered it doesn't mean it wouldn't be scientific and physical.
Right, but you can't just make up any possible, what if, and then go on an indefinite rant of possible things, like what if fairies came and pushed the limestone down? What if there's a brand new limestone element that has a new place on the periodic table that then later decayed into what we think of as limestone? What if the force of gravity were different? What if water suddenly had a weird instance back in the past where it just didn't have the viscosity it has now? What if Brownian motion ceased? These are the kinds of things that
I'm not proposing any variance in the fundamentals of physics, I don't think.
Well, there are no variations then that would allow for limestone to deposit faster, because all of the variance that we've been able to find for the deposition goes slower than that. The maximum rate that we can find that's concordant with physics and chemistry, which chemistry is just physics, is about a centimeter per millennium.
Right,
roughly.
But that's, like you keep saying, the maximum we can find. That means, that there could be, hypothetically, some other conditions at some prior time, like, for example, the Great Flood mentioned in Genesis, that produced conditions that we cannot study today.
But we can, because we know what floods are. Floods are turbulent events in which water is where it normally isn't, and we know how water works. And while we don't have a perfect handle on things like turbulent flow and things like that, we do know the effect of turbulence on things like the deposition of sediment, because we can see turbulent flow producing sediment. And what it tends to do is produce a graded bedding in which the largest and heaviest sediments go towards the bottom, and then the sediments get smaller and lighter as you go up. But that's not what limestone is. And so a flood prohibits limestone formation for the duration of the flood. And in order to say that, in fact, it could accelerate limestone, you would have to come up with brand new physics for that because we know what turbulent water does, and it does not accelerate the deposition of non-graded small grain sizes, especially with grains that are liable to dissolve back into water given variation in pH, which floods also tend to have because they're mixing up water and sediment from multiple locations, which tends to cause, a lot of fluctuations in things like pH and temperature, which means that we know for a fact that unless you're going to invoke exotic physics, floods prohibit significant limestone deposition.
Well, and here's where I'll just have to say I don't have an answer. I don't know I personally think that you're underselling a little bit the foreignness of the conditions that are described in Genesis, but obviously that's something of a hypothetical,
well, I don't
perhaps
think
a
I
rescuing
am.
device for me or whatever, but
I don't think I am, and let me tell you why. So this is connected to radio isotope dating, but it's not exactly the same thing. So a little while back, there was a group of young Earth creationists, like professionals, people with letters after their name, like PhD, who conducted a very, I think it was almost like a decade-long project called the Radioisotope and the Age of the Earth Project, or whatever, RATE. They did the RATE project. And they
I
published
think
their
I've heard
results.
of this.
Okay. Well, in their results, they indicated a few things. One of which was that, in fact, the amount of radiation was consistent with an ancient age of the Earth, and that they did not have a solution to the problem of dissipating all of the heat from all the processes that they said, based on their flood model, happened during the flood year, and that they would have to rely on exotic physics. That's where I got that phrase, is from the RATE project. What
Okay.
exotic physics means is just new physics that no one has ever thought of and that violate our current understanding of physics.
Right.
So the conclusion of the RATE project was, we need magic, or the Earth looks old. And so when a whole bunch of people who not only have degrees in this subject, but who also are strongly motivated to find any reason that the science could point towards a young Earth, come back and basically admit defeat, sans magic, I feel pretty confident in saying that, yeah, all of the actual scientific evidence points towards an old Earth, and I don't get that necessarily. Well, I don't only get that from, conventional scientists. I get that from the top names in young Earth creationism, because that's the conclusion they were forced into.
Yeah. I have to concede that what you're saying does have weight. I don't really have an answer.
Well, it
I
seems
hope
like
that's not disappointing.
I mean, I don't know if it's disappointing or not because I don't know what my expectations are.
Okay.
So yeah, don't worry too much about disappointing me because I don't actually know what my expectations are or if I have any. So
It's quite hard to disappoint a
but-
150 million year old dinosaur, to be fair. So
right, yeah, there is that. So where that leaves me is it seems like you're in a situation in which you know that there is evidence that seems to run counter to your conclusion about what Genesis 1 and 2, and also getting into like we'll just say 1 through 11, right? Because that's the whole primeval history from Genesis, right? After that,
Yeah.
that's the end of the Noah story. Then we get into the
Patriarchal history. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it seems to me like there is sufficient evidence to call into question your interpretation of the primeval history from Genesis. And if I'm right about that, is that something that you would then go ahead and like come up with an alternative? Because I will say the majority of Christians belong to ecclesial bodies or denominations that do not have opposition to the ancient age of the earth or common ancestry or evolution broadly as part of their like required beliefs or even encouraged beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah, I acknowledge that. And of course, I have friends like that. Michael Toon is one of them. I respect that a lot. I don't think that seems plausible to me, certainly not from my vantage point currently, because, and I kind of want to give you like an analogy, and I'm trying to think up the analogy like right now, so this might come off a little wonky, but let's say you do business with some institution, and they tell you that they give you an invoice or a bill for money that you owe to them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it's $1,000. Maybe it's a medical bill or something. Maybe that's a U.S. thing. But anyway,
It's all right. I live in the U.S. I get it.
yeah. So like, then let's say you're walking out of that building where you just got that bill, and someone on the street flags you down, runs to catch up to you, and says, "Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. There, you just got duped. You don't actually owe that money to them."
Okay.
The reason I'm like describing this is because I'm trying to make a point about information sources, right? So like,
Okay.
to me, the Bible and my interpretation of the Bible weighs very, very heavily on the specific topic of the origins of life and the beginning of history. So science can weigh in like with opinions or, helpful data. But to me, science is like on that topic specifically, science is the guest in the room. There is no authority that science has over that topic. It can offer data, and that data is worth analyzing, but ultimately the overriding authority, to me, is Scripture. And I know that people will disagree with that. That's fine. That's just where I am personally. So like the information you're offering, it's definitely noteworthy. It just doesn't have the weight to me that I think it has for you, and probably
so
for.
I went into this with the understanding that for you, we had established that if the physical evidence counter-indicated your interpretation, that would be a problem for your interpretation and not for the physical evidence. And you now seem to have reversed course on that.
No, I think I was careful when you were asking that question to say undeniable physical evidence. Which maybe I misunderstood your question, but I think
So maybe I missed that word. I don't know. Maybe I was optimistically interpreting it to be more in line with what I'm thinking. It doesn't matter.
I believe there is a great strength to my interpretation of Genesis. I can't definitively rule out that my interpretation is wrong, but I think there's a great strength to it that doesn't warrant challenge from the information you've offered.
Okay. I want to be not mean, but blunt.
Okay.
Your interpretation of Genesis leads to an account of the history of the earth that is absolutely precluded physically by both literal and metaphorical mountains of evidence. And it is at least as unlikely to be true as the flat earth that you debunk. There is no physical possibility that is open to us in which the earth is 6,000 years old, unless God is a liar. That is the only option, because everything about the earth, every last thing about it, is only concordant with a billions of years old, or at the very least, millions of years old history. There is no possibility. So whatever it is we talk about, whether it be things like cosmic ray exposure, whether it be radiometric dating, deposition rates, the fossil record, just the geological column overall, all of these things produce preclusions to young Earth creationism. Young Earth creationism would require our fundamental understanding of physics, cosmology, astronomy, optics, geology, chemistry, biology, to all be fundamentally wrong on a level similar to the flat Earth. Young Earth creationism requires that we not understand the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force, and that we not understand what the weak nuclear force even is. It also requires that the way that water operates under the conditions of just the laws of physics be wildly different. It requires that the first law of thermodynamics be bullshit. It requires that light doesn't actually travel at the speed of light in a vacuum.
I don't know about that.
Well, then distant starlight is going to be a problem for you.
No, because I believe that's just a phenomenological language in Genesis. I don't think that's a problem.
So you are a young Earther but old Universer?
I don't see a problem with the edges of the universe being that we observe. See, the semantics are so much of a barrier here when we talk about the edges of the universe or the age of the universe. In the terms that we use nowadays, in the conventions that we use nowadays of like extrapolating, this is so many light years away and this is the speed of light and therefore what we're seeing now is so many years ago. That whole process logically that we use to infer, what we're seeing being long ago, I don't think it has any bearing at all on the language in Genesis. So, to me, using that logic, as far as we know, the apocalypse and the end of the world has already happened at the edges of the universe. And it's just, coming inward toward us perhaps at the speed of light. We don't know.
Let's say that there is a galaxy that is 5 million light years away. And did that light actually travel for 5 million years to get to Earth?
Define 5 million years.
Okay, so the second is an SI unit, which is defined by, I believe it's the wavelength of some atom. We'll just accept that definition.
Cesium.
And then 1 minute is 60 of those. Cesium, okay. 1 minute is 60 of those. 1 hour is 60 of those. 1 day is 25 of those. 1 year is 365.245 of those. And then if you multiply that number of seconds by 5 million, that's what I mean by 5 million years.
Okay, but that's all at the Earth's rest frame?
No. I'm saying, did that light travel for that period of time?
Well, the light itself doesn't necessarily experience time the same way that we would. So you have to be referring to an observer on Earth, right?
Let's say you're an observer. Was there a galaxy 5 million light years away to be an observer in when that light was emitted?
Okay.
And then that observer would have to wait 5 million years for it to get to Earth. Was that a thing that there could have been an observer in? Not that there was. Was there a galaxy that existed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, then in that case, I would say that you think the universe is old.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
I think it's a semantics thing, given special relativity or general relativity. I don't think that it's an issue.
I mean,
for
we could
Genesis,
get into like, four-dimensional world lines and talking about distances in space-time. If you would like to do that, I would rather not, because I don't really want to do four-dimensional vector math. I do that for my job.
Also, it's probably my education on it might be a barrier for us to go there, but
okay, so we can be okay with the old Earth. So fair enough. I will.
You mean old universe?
Yeah, I'm sorry, old universe. I will retract that your position requires that that light not travel at the speed of light in a vacuum, but it still requires virtually everything else that we know about physics, including many of the fundamental laws of nature, like things like fundamental constants in quantum mechanics, the strength of fundamental forces, to be altered or to simply be inconsistent. And at that point, we can't do science. Because remember, if we're going to do science at all, we have to start with the assumption that the ways in which the universe operate are going to be consistent. And the entire endeavor of scientific creationism is to say that, in fact, the primeval history in Genesis is compatible with science.
Yes.
So how do we do that? Because I've picked limestone as my first example. Mm-hmm. And basically the response was, well, maybe things were different in the past. And when I pointed out that this is based on very fundamental aspects of physics, like the viscosity of water, how Brownian motion works, how gravity works, how chemistry works, you basically said, well, maybe there's just something else. And to me, that just says, well, maybe physics was different in the past, which takes us outside the realm of science, which means that it's not actually true that you would ever accept physical evidence over your interpretation of the Bible, because if you're willing to change physics, then it's literally impossible for physical evidence to overcome that amount of willingness to disregard science, which I will point out is in fact pretty flat earthery.
Yeah, I'm sure that it seems that way to you, and I let me say that the reason I'm okay with saying, I don't know, maybe there's something. The reason I'm okay with that is primarily because I'm not convinced that what you're saying is true, that it would require a change in the most fundamental physics that we know.
But don't believe me. Believe the rate team, because they're professional young Earth creationists, and they're telling you the same thing.
Do you mind if
okay.
I ask a question?
I mean,
is it okay if I ask a quick question at this point? Because one of the things that always confuses me about young Earth creationism is the fact that, for me, the existence of lead is a slam dunk evidence that the Earth is billions of years old, because lead can only exist after a bunch of other elements have broken down before it, which takes an extremely long time to happen. So how is there such an abundance of an element that can only exist after radiometric decay happening a bunch of times that takes such a long time?
Okay, that seems to me like a much more naive question, forgive me for the term, than what he was asking about limestone, because he said limestone is related to biology. But
it is
lead,
one of the reasons I picked it, yeah.
Yeah, lead is simply an element, so there's nothing about it that implies some forensic meaning, like this only could exist by this process. The creationist contention is that everything about the very beginning of the world was a miracle of God. So why on earth would it be a problem for creationism that there's too much lead? God could have just made some of it at the beginning.
Well,
that's not a problem to me at all.
Could you possibly define miracle for me, and what that actually means in the sense of creating the world?
It would be something transcending above the laws of physics that we can study today.
So we can't really even look at physics in the conversation then, if we're just going to say, well, God could do something outside of physics.
Well, this is such a, and this is where the conversation would always go when I was a teenager, and this is why I felt so strong in my convictions, without necessarily knowing all the details that Dapper Dino's prying into, because it always ended up seeming to me like a question of philosophy. What is it? What kind of question do we even consider it to be, to ask? How did the universe begin? Like, is that a scientific question? Is it a physics question? Is it a theology question? Is it a religious question? I think it's, to some extent, all of the above. But I think the latter, theology and religion, are, at least in some circles of today's society, vastly underappreciated for that question. So, the laws of physics, to me, had a beginning, right? God is the transcendent first cause, the uncaused cause, right? He is the beginning of the chain of causality, right? And that includes the laws of physics themselves, right? So when we talk about, what is or is not a miracle, by definition, the beginning of the universe had to be a miracle if God was the creator of the universe.
So when we see things on Earth sorry, just one more thing. So if we see things on Earth that physics says can only exist if the process has taken millions and maybe billions of years, your response is just going to be, well, God made it that way as part of the miracle. I don't want to strawman you in any way. Is that how you would answer that? Because there is things on Earth that we can see and tests that are clearly older than, say, 6,000 years old. So okay. Is it your position that God put those things there and made them seem that they're older than 6,000 years old as part of the miracle?
it depends on what they are. So like, and this is something that I often seems to come up in this conversation, is like the appearance of age and what counts as, God lying versus what counts as us simply misinterpreting something that appears to us as age. So like, for example, and this is maybe not the best example because of what we were just talking about phenomenology regarding old starlight. But let's say we see a star explode in a distant part of the galaxy. Let's say it's or maybe just to make it easier, like a different galaxy. So it's millions of light years away, and we see this star explode in this distant galaxy. The image of that explosion is reaching our eyes on Earth or our telescopes. And that is an event that's happening, right? I would never say that God just created the light in transit and that there was never a star at all. I think I made that argument like one time when I was 10 years old. And then somebody, walked me through the logic of it and pointed out that it does make God into a liar. And I was like, oh, that is a bad argument. So I would never say that. However, there's some gray area when we're talking about, for example, tree rings, and I'm not aware of any tree rings being, countable past, 6,000 years, but let's say they were, for the sake of argument, like as an example, tree rings seem to encode certain information, like how much rainfall there was on a certain year and that sort of thing. And it's like, if God created a tree with tree rings that were different widths that we then interpret as rainfall during years that never happened, would that make God a liar? Well, that's a gray area. I don't know if it would or not, because that's,
I don't think it's a gray area. I think that's a definitive yes. Because the thing is, God wouldn't have to do that if he's all powerful. He could just make an adult tree that didn't have rings. Similarly, if God had created Adam with scars from injuries that he never had, I think that would be a dishonest thing to do.
Well, right, but what is it about tree rings that would imply on God's part, you should read these as information that's not true?
Because that's what tree rings do. They tell us about the life history of a tree. And if there is no life history of the tree, then there's no reason for the tree rings. And if God created a false life history...
That's what we use them for.
It's not just what we use them for. It's how they're produced. The fact that humans use them that way is a byproduct of the fact that that's what they are. Tree rings are what happens when trees undergo periods of growth and stasis on the basis of the environment around them, which typically happens in annual cycles. Now, it can happen a little bit differently than that, depending on the weather and whatnot. But overall, what happens is during the time when the tree is growing during the year, it starts to produce a new ring. Then as it stops, it produces the darker section as it slows down. And then the next year it speeds back up and you get a ring. That's how rings are produced. The only reason humans care about them in terms of dating is because they're produced that way. And so if God produces rings, they're not produced this way, but that show an evident history anyway. Because remember, that's how tree rings form in the first place. That is God giving a fictional account of the life of that tree. Just like if he wrote a book that had a fictional author that just appeared last Thursday and changed your memory to remember that book always having existed, that's God lying to you.
Right. And I think that this is an important juncture in our conversation, because this reveals a certain disagreement that I think we have. I might agree with you about tree rings. That's why I said that they're in a gray area for me. Like, I think I might... If I, with tree rings in particular, if I had to pick only one of the two categories, then I might lean toward, like, yes, those are actual records of events, and God could not make a tree that already had rings in it. But I don't know that for sure. Like, let me look toward the more extreme opposite end, okay? In Genesis, it says God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and it says that he made the animals and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, and somehow that probably includes something resembling a chicken, for example. So, you know, your argument to me sounds a little bit like if you were to say, we only see chickens come from eggs. Therefore, if God made a chicken, that would be him lying to us.
Okay, let me clarify. I don't think that creating a universe, even one in which things are already set up, say for humans, is a necessarily dishonest thing on the part of God. What I mean is, any aspect of the universe which is the result of a process that is known to take time, which does not need to give the indications of that time, but that includes those indications anyway, is a dishonest thing. So, for instance, God could presumably make a tree that simply only has one big ring, but that's the size of an adult tree that had been there for 40 years. God could form an adult human out of whatever without giving him any of the scars that he might have acquired in an actual life of, say, 30 years. God could create an adult chicken that similarly wouldn't have any scars or healed broken bones. And yeah, sure, it would look like a chicken that came from an egg, but that's only of necessity. However, the world is full of things that there does not seem to be any particular necessity for, that indicate long processes, which on their own indicate that that's at least how old the Earth is, unless God set up the evidence to make the Earth look older than it is unnecessarily. So it's the necessary part that's important for me. And to be fair, I did not express that terribly well at the outset. So no, I don't think making a chicken is dishonest because chickens come from eggs. However, if that chicken were made as a baby chick that never hatched, but he made the egg anyway, and there was a bunch of eggshells, that would seem dishonest.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But I want to point out, this is why when I was talking to you and we talked about limestone, we came to an impasse where I just didn't know how to answer you. But the reason we started talking about this, like what counts as God lying versus not, is because Craig brought up lead. And I don't think simply the existence of a certain amount of a certain element in the earth would imply anything about the age of that element. Like, God could just create that amount of the element. I don't see any issue with that at all.
Okay, well, let's zoom in on a more specific example than just the bare existence of lead. Let's take a look at the Oklo reactor. So the Oklo reactor is a now extinct but formerly active fission reactor in which uranium was induced to fission by the moderation of neutrons through water in a similar manner to modern water-cooled and moderated fission reactors that we use commercially or militarily in some cases, but that was actually a natural formation. And the reason it was detected was because it had an unusual isotope ratio in uranium, despite being rich in uranium. And the ratio was consistent with spent fuel from a nuclear reactor. And so then it was investigated and found that, in fact, we found the products of decay chains from fission events from uranium, because that's all well documented, right? Nuclear power is a thing. I used to be a nuclear technician. Craig also has a history in the nuclear energy field. So we both know that, it's well characterized, the typical things that uranium fissions into, what those decay chain products are, what they ultimately end in, what kind of isotopic ratios you expect in spent fuel. And all of this lined up with a reactor that had been operating for longer than you think the universe has been around, longer ago than you think the universe has been around. Why did God make a fake...
I'm so sorry. I think I'm going to need you to dumb that down a little for me.
Okay, so nuclear reactors, fission reactors work like this, right? Every once in a while, a uranium atom will split apart, and it will release two or more daughter elements, as well as a few neutrons that go flying around. Right?
They call that spontaneous fission, right?
Right. Now, those neutrons are flying around at extremely high speed that make them unlikely to interact with other uranium nuclei. But if they interact first with a bit of water, they can lower their energy levels enough that rather than just kind of shooting right through uranium nuclei, instead they get absorbed, transferring that energy, which then destabilizes that particular nucleus, which then is more likely to fission. That's induced fission.
Okay.
Now, we can tell if a sample of uranium has undergone induced fission because different isotopes of uranium are more or less likely to undergo induced fission based on moderation of water for those neutrons. So you can take a sample of uranium and say, has this undergone induced fission, yes or no? And you can check that by just looking at the isotopic ratios.
Okay.
When in Oklo, people were digging for fissile uranium, they were hoping to enrich this uranium for use in nuclear fuel. They found it had already been depleted. It had already been used for induced fission. And they said, okay, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but let's check the other decay products to see if they're also there. Because we know when uranium fissions, we know what it tends to fission into. We know what those things decay into. We know what the end result of those decay products are. We know what ratios they should be there in.
Okay.
Because we do this ourselves. And when that was checked, it turned out that yes, this was a naturally occurring fission reactor that by all indications had run for longer than 6,000 years. In fact, it had run for millions of years. And it had done so billions of years ago. Why did God place a spent nuclear reactor that gives every indication of having run for longer than he says the universe has existed? Why did he do that? That either seems like that's a very obvious case of God being dishonest, or it is a slam dunk for an old Earth.
I mean, well, where my mind goes is like this probably falls under the category generally of radiometric dating. Like,
Nope.
I've
Because
always
the dating isn't required to check the isotopic ratios to see if it's consistent with a nuclear reactor. When you check to see if something has undergone spontaneous fission, you're not doing radiometric dating.
no,
You are
I
just-
know.
Okay.
I meant like rhetorically, it falls under that same category. Like, because
Of physics?
basically that if let's say there is some unknown condition that we have never observed and have never studied that was present in Noah's flood that did in fact result in accelerated nuclear decay. And I know there's a heat problem. I know
Okay,
there's
it's not the heat problem. Here's the thing. You know what the nucleus is, right?
yeah, roughly.
Okay. The nucleus is the protons and the neutrons at the middle of an atom surrounded by the electron shells. Right?
Yeah.
You do realize that the spontaneous and even induced nuclear processes do not care what the pressure is or even really what the temperature is. The only way in which temperature can matter is in the frequency of induced nuclear interactions. So when we're talking about spontaneous interactions, which many of these are because we're checking on decay chains, those are all spontaneous. It is physically impossible for any amount of pressure or heat to cause a problem until you get hot enough that the atom itself starts to fall apart. Not just turns to plasma, but starts to break apart into a gluon plasma, which is hotter than any known temperature currently in existence. So
Yeah,
unless you want
okay.
to say that the heat problem is way worse than anyone thinks, you do not have a physical mechanism that can affect the nucleus of an atom.
Okay.
Atomic nuclei just don't give a crap.
Okay, I think this helps actually for like my education. I've heard people say things like that that it's a fundamental law of physics how fast nuclear things decay, and then later I've heard literature on like, oh well, when the point at which this would start to change, and I'm like, wait, so can it change or not? But this helps me understand.
What's fundamental about it is the weak nuclear force, right? That's what's holding on to these neutrons and protons and keeping them in a pile. So the strength of the weak nuclear force will tell you how likely it is for a given period of time for a atomic nucleus to decay in some manner, whether it be through fission, alpha decay, beta decay, whatever, right? And that is based on that fundamental law of how strong the weak nuclear force is.
Yeah.
So the only way that you could change the decay rate within the frame of reference of the nucleus, at least, is to change the strength of one of the fundamental forces. And the problem with that is, if you want to accelerate nuclear decay, you have to weaken the strength of the weak nuclear force. But that creates an additional problem. It creates new decay chains. Atoms that were nuclei that were previously stable will no longer be stable. And we would be able to see evidence of these new decay chains. And no one has ever bothered to bring forth such evidence.
Yeah.
So we know that there's no good reason to think that the strength of the weak nuclear force has changed over time. Especially since, I mean, if the rate team had noticed that, I'm sure they would have brought it up.
So this is an interesting point in our conversation as well, because we've moved from talking about something biology related to talking about something non-biology related.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, exegetically, in Genesis, that is a very important difference. Now, obviously, I still have the problems that you brought up earlier about limestone and such.
Mm-hmm.
But something does come to mind which seems relevant to share when we're talking about something non-biological. I want to point out in Genesis 1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, etc., etc. And there was evening and there was morning the first day." Creation week begins. Now, verse 1, where it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," that, I believe, is something called an introductory encapsulation. That's a summary of all the events it's about to cover again in detail.
I mean, I would say that you're wrong about that, but I'm not sure why it matters.
Well, okay, let me get on with what I was saying. But there is a lot of room here for possible interpretation of millions of years where there is no life on Earth, but geology processes might go on. Like,
so why don't you take at least that position?
I have no problem with that position.
So then why do you consider yourself a young Earther?
Well, because a lot of the old Earth arguments involve there being life and death in cycles for millions of years before even mankind rose, which I think there's a big exegetical problem with that.
So can we say that you are a old Earther, young lifer?
I mean, I guess, if we want to get that...
Well, because so typically the young
specific.
Earth creationist position tends to be that the universe, the Earth, and life are all young. But those are technically separable items, right? You could believe that in descending order, right? You could say that the universe is old, but the Earth and life are together young. Or you could say that the Earth is old and the universe is old, but that life is relatively young. So
sure, I guess. I mean...
So, and I would say that going from everything's young and then going to, well, the universe is old is an improvement in terms of accepting the scientific evidence. And I would say that we're doing what I would consider, maybe you would disagree, progress, in that you are currently at least open to an old physical Earth and an old physically existing universe. But now the question is, has life existed for, say, more than 10,000 years?
Yeah, and this is why at the beginning I emphasized my reason for being a young Earth creationist is rooted in this text. I hold this text as sacred, and I believe that it's true. And so the question becomes, what is the meaning of this text? For me, that's what the question is. And so if I find some way to adjust my understanding of the text so that the text is still held in high regard, still taken at face value, but, it agrees with, what we observe in nature, then absolutely, that is the correct position in my mind. And so...
So what is wrong with the interpretation that this text is primarily an ideological text that is there to inform believers about what their proper relationship with God and the natural world is, and the proper relationship between God and the natural world and humans? And also, you can go ahead with various typological interpretations about, Jesus being typified in Adam and, things like that. Why is that not an okay thing to go with? And then just say, but the literal interpretation of an actual literal history of the world is less important to me because I don't need that for the theological ideas about the proper relationship between God and man in the world and the typological things that are called out in the New Testament. Because none of that depends strictly on the literal history
Right.
of Genesis 1 and 2.
Right, and this is why there are many Christians who I do respect who take that view. Like, I'm not going to say that those people are not Christian or that their view is fundamentally inferior to mine or anything, and that includes people like Michael Heiser.
Rest in peace.
Yes. So, there are reasons why I disagree with him, and one thing, and this is one thing I was going to bring up earlier, but like we were saying maybe that's a topic for another day. You were kind of making thrusts and assertions on the text here that I believe are coming from a place of historical criticism. It's a historical critical approach.
I mean, I do have a history degree, so it does help.
Well, I'm referring to a specific movement, coming from 19th century Germany. It's also called higher criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, it's higher criticism is a good way, but right now it's basically just biblical scholarship is what it is.
Well, I disagree with that approach to biblical history.
Okay.
I don't accept that. I think it comes from a fundamental place of skepticism. Now, of course, Michael Heiser accepted historical criticism. And he was a genuine Christian. I would never say that he was like a fake Christian or anything, and that's fine. Like, if Christians want to accept that, but I don't. I don't think that's a valid source of scholarship for this text, personally.
So taking history and textual analysis seriously is not something we should do with the Bible.
I don't think that's a fair way to characterize it.
I do, though, because the thing is, everyone who has an alternate take on that, it just comes back to, well, I believe what I believe about the text, and that's incompatible with what we're getting from things like archaeology, textual analysis, and history. Therefore, I reject those things, and I will come up with an alternative explanation, which, while perhaps not impossible, is not supported by the data, but I choose to accept it anyway. And I'm not going to tell you can't do that. You absolutely can. But what I am going to tell you is that if one of your goals is to be as little like a flat earther as possible, that is not a great way to go about it. Because what that is it is literally just taking a conclusion that you like on the basis of your theology, which you did not derive simply from a sober reading of the universe around you and this particular text. That was something that was handed down to you through a theological tradition. And you've decided that that is going to be more important to me than following the data where they lead. Because I can tell you right now, no one who follows the data where they lead comes out with a Mosaic authorship for Genesis.
But I don't think that's taking the text.
Guys, we've got about 10 minutes left of open discussion, and then we're going to read some questions, okay?
Okay.
All right, sorry, Peter.
Yeah, we are probably starting to get into the weeds a little bit here anyway, so.
Because basically what I'm saying is, it seems like, despite your protestations to otherwise, that what I'm seeing in your rhetoric today really does come down to you have decided that a certain thing is true, and it is less important to you to follow the evidence than to come up with anything that will let you keep believing that, as long as it's not logically impossible. But that's not what science is. And if you want to have a scientific outlook, which you don't have to, but if that's what you do want to do, then you have to follow the evidence to where it most likely leads, rather than clinging to some possibility that you can say, well, look, I've shown that it's not completely impossible that Moses was a guy who wrote Genesis through the dictates of the Holy Spirit to make sure he got it physically accurate, even though the physical evidence on Earth doesn't quite comport with that. I'm okay, because we'll just add in a whole bunch of miracles. All of that is basically just the same thing as someone saying, well, yeah, I know my model doesn't actually account for a midnight sun in Antarctica, but I'm sure I can come up with some excuse.
I would not characterize it that way, but
I know, but that's because it's your bias. That's the reason. Everyone, I'm not going to say everyone, but the chat is noticing that that is in fact your bias, and that yes, you are in fact acting like a flat earther when it comes to this topic.
Yeah, I suppose that was the inevitable conclusion of this conversation.
Possibly. I hope I wasn't too mean about getting there, though.
No, you're fine. Thank you.
So do you see why it is that everyone and I mean, by everyone, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but do you see why it is that the general consensus seems to be that you are, in fact, giving the same kinds of arguments that flat earthers give, just about a different topic?
Yeah.
Okay. And also, I agree with the flat earthers that the Bible, at least in the Old Testament, does in fact strongly imply that the earth is flat.
Well, of course, because historical criticism would lead you there, just like it did with Michael Heiser. However, I do want to point out that is still a non-robothemist flat model.
Oh, yeah, it is. The flat earthers are wrong about the biblical flat earth.
Yeah.
The biblical flat earth has a sun that sets, and it would not have had time zones.
Which is frankly more scientific.
Yeah, it's as long as you don't travel too widely and don't have a way to check time in an objective manner that doesn't rely on just your subjective senses, yeah, it would be virtually impossible for someone who never really left, like, you know, the few miles surrounding their Near Eastern Iron Age village to distinguish between the flat earth and the round earth. Because, like, even a couple days ago when I was talking to Craig about how easy it is to show that the earth is round, my example was call someone in a different time zone. You can't do that in the Iron Age. So
I literally did that in my first Flat Earth debunk video. I called two different people, in one in the UK and one in the United Arab Emirates.
Oh,
and I was
very
like,
nice.
So
that's one of the countries I've been to. I had fun there. I feel like I don't need to go back.
I bet if you guys both look out your windows right now, it's light, isn't it? Or just getting dark?
Yeah, it is light here. It'll be dark here in about, I think, a couple hours.
Yeah, it's been dark here for about 6 hours.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I'll grant you, like, I don't blame the biblical authors for having a flat earth worldview. Like, I think that is the reasonable conclusion for them to come to. I just think that when people say that that is not the conclusion that they came to, and that they didn't indicate that in the text, I think they're wrong about that. And the only arguments I've seen to counter that come down to, well, I don't know much Hebrew, but these translators translated it in a way that's compatible with the globe, which to me isn't much of an argument.
I mean, I don't think the text argues for a globe either.
I don't think it argues for a globe. I think it assumes a globe.
Wait, do you mean flat?
Sorry, a flat Earth. Sorry, I don't think it argues for the shape of the Earth. I think it assumes a flat Earth.
Right,
sorry,
right.
I misspoke.
So what I was saying is I don't see any text that specifies that it's a globe. Some people try to shoehorn that in, and I don't see it. So,
all right. But yeah, I would say that maybe this is a topic to dive into. Start with the universe, right? Like, are you okay with an old universe? If that's okay, then okay, move on to the physical Earth, and then if you come to a conclusion about the physical Earth being old, then you can move into biology. And if at some point you have hang-ups where you're not sure what's going on, you can always reach out. You know, I'm around. I might want to have some conversations publicly, just, you know, so I have content. But still, because I do think that if you decide to, like you did with the shape of the Earth, rather than simply accept a particular position because it is the easy position to come to on the basis of a text, if instead you decide that you're willing to set aside the easiest interpretation of that text and look at the physical evidence and accept that scientific principles are generally valid, because, I mean, they continue to work, we're using them to talk right now, then I do think it will be inevitable that you will have to come to the conclusion that the Earth is old, that life is old, and that, yes, there has been death for billions of years, really, and that however much discomfort that might cause you in terms of your theology, you're just going to have to figure that out. But the good news is, if you want to stay a Christian, which I don't particularly care either way, but if you do want to, you can check out BioLogos for theistic evolution resources from a particularly Protestant standpoint. And if you are not a Protestant, which seems like you probably are, but if you're not, there are other organizations, like the Catholic Church hasn't been insisting on creationism for a very long time. If you happen to be like Eastern Orthodox, they just don't seem to care very much about the question. I don't think I've ever heard one of them really discuss it much, except a few who have complained about evolution and just said, well, Saint so-and-so said no, which I don't really consider to be much of a discussion, but whatever.
Right, I think that's a good point to...
No offense, but I don't really... Yeah, I don't really want that advice. I appreciate where it's coming from, but this is gonna have to be my personal.
Yeah, I understand that it's a very
personal
journey for you. but that's a good point to stop the back and forth conversation. And I've got to say, guys, that it is nice, it's refreshing, and different to be involved in a conversation where, you know, two people can actually act like adults. In flat Earth debates, even me and Toon can get angry and shouting at because of the people we are dealing with. But because you both seem to be decent, well, one of you is a human, one of you is a dinosaur from hundreds of millions of years ago, but you're both decent beings, you know, and this was actually an enjoyable conversation to listen to. Before we get to the questions for the from the chat, I just want to say thank you to you both for being here. I'll make sure that both the channels are linked in the description. And Peter, I've got one question for you myself, and that is that you've obviously examined the flat Earth critically, you know, using empirical data and observations and logic, and it clearly leads you to a conclusion that the Earth is a globe. Do you think that if you were to remove the religious aspect of your view of the Earth and just looked at the evidence critically, that you could still be a young Earth creationist, or would you have to, the same way you have with the globe, reach a different the conclusion that science also agrees with?
I'm afraid that's something of an unparsable counterfactual for me. You basically said, if you were to have a lobotomy, then what would you think? Like,
okay,
I can't remove the religious aspect.
Removing an aspect for it is hard. Okay, well, do you just think that
I'm
if
sorry.
you...
that might be a disappointing answer.
I mean, for me, it's... I kind of find that hard to understand because I don't have a religious aspect, so I can look at things outside of that, but
yeah.
I guess for you, I understand it's so deeply rooted that you wouldn't be able to do that. But, okay, to rephrase the question then, do you just think if you use the same logical deductions and the way of looking at things that you do as Flat Earth, that young Earth creationism could still hold water?
Well, that's honestly why I attack Flat Earth. For me, it's coming from my young Earth creationism. And part of the reason I'm so passionate about it is because I find it to be such an ugly, insulting imitation of young Earth creationism.
Yeah, even though, as you and Dapper have discussed, sometimes the way that you can discuss it can seem flat earther-ish because you have to ignore evidence. For instance, a lot of the discussions are beat down a flat earther and beat them down, and then it will get to, well, God did it, which seems to be the same thing that you will do to some degree. You at the end of it, your answer is, well, it was a miracle, and God made the Earth this way, which it's very similar to the answer that flat earthers will eventually give, and you do see the parallel there, yeah?
Well, the thing is, like, in order to grant that there is not just a superficial similarity or a tactical similarity or whatever, but a similarity in substance to my view with flat earthers, in order to recognize that, I have to basically synthesize in my mind what it looks like from your point of view, or for Dapper's point of view. Like, that's not what it looks like from my point of view. I don't see it from my point of view. I can only see it if I take your point of view. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I suppose for Dapper and I, we go where the evidence shows. No, regardless of our personal feelings or any religious bias or anything, we just go where the evidence shows. If when Toon and Co go to Antarctica and disprove the globe, I'm gonna go where the evidence goes, and I just feel like it's very hard to hold your position if you go where the evidence goes.
I mean, I suppose things might be different if I was if I reached a much higher level of formal training in any of these relevant fields like chemistry, geology, paleontology, those things. Like, maybe I could offer a more substantive answer to your question if I had college level training in those things. I took a gen ed in earth science, but that doesn't really, get me there. So
I will say, generally speaking, to debunk any young Earth creationist claim, it usually doesn't require much more than a freshman or sophomore undergraduate level of education in the field. Often it requires far less. So you would not need to get degrees in most of these things. In order to figure out why young Earth creationist arguments are wrong for any particular field, basically you could audit like the intro course to that subject at a college, which usually, you mean by auditing, I mean you just go in for the lectures, take notes. You don't take the tests, you don't do the assignments, you don't get a grade, you're not enrolled. You're just there to learn. And usually, if you take just the intro course, that'll be enough to get rid of about 40-ish% of young Earth creationist claims. And if you then go on to audit a few more courses, that usually covers basically the rest of them. It is very rare that a young Earth creationist claim that is contrary to science comes about and is not debunkable by a sophomore undergrad in a relevant field.
Okay.
That's not just me. That is the general consensus that I found from asking actual professors in fields relevant to young Earth creationism.
So my final question before moving to the audience is that so the same question I ask a lot of flat earthers: what would convince you that you're wrong?
I don't know.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
It's as much a problem when flat earthers say it as it is when you say it.
I've never heard a flat earther answer that way, to be honest.
I mean, usually they just say nothing, but I don't know. It works out to be about the same thing. Because it's trivially easy for me to say what would change my mind for almost anything. Like, you ask me about anything that I happen to think is true, I can very easily tell you what would change my mind about it. Like, if you want to say common ancestry for cellular life, very easy. Just find an organism that morphologically looks like it should be related to some other cellular life, but who, at least in its neutral DNA, does not actually fall into the nested hierarchy that's produced by phylogenetics at the neutral DNA level. Right there, I'm already going to say, okay, that thing doesn't seem to share common ancestry with other cellular life. That's it. Like, it's trivially easy for me for almost everything that I can say that I believe to come up with an example as to what would cause me to not believe it anymore, or at least to modify that belief significantly.
But that doesn't sound like a very big leap for you. Like, you could still say that all this other life over here has a common ancestor. We're just carving out this one exception. Like that.
Well, yeah, but like that's what I'm saying is, if you want to go further and further back, I can come up with more and more examples of possible, and by possible I mean logically possible observations that would get me to change my mind. And would it get me to change everything about that position? No, it would probably make me modify. But at the very least, I can say something that would make me significantly modify every single belief that I have. And the fact that that isn't the case for you about a particular topic is troubling, because I'll bet you could think up something that would change your mind about the shape of the Earth, right? Like, if the final experiment comes back and it turns out, yeah, the sun sets, I'll bet that would change your mind about the shape of the Earth, wouldn't it?
It would throw me into confusion.
But I would say that's a change of your mind, because right now I don't think you feel confused about the shape of the Earth.
Right.
Yeah. So you should be able to do that about your other beliefs.
Yeah, there's lots of things that could throw me into confusion about young Earth creationism. I mean,
well, what's one of those?
I realize
I'm now just going back into open discussion. I'm sorry, Craig.
That's okay. Right, do you want to respond to that, Peter, and then we'll get to open to questions from the audience?
I don't know if I have a very good response ready. We should probably just move on.
I appreciate how open you've been. I know that you were nervous for this. I know that you aren't really this isn't something you really want to debate as much, but I really appreciate the conversation. It's been very interesting. Nathan Bishop became a new member. Thank you. Electric IPM for $2 says, Peter, how old do you think the Earth actually is then?
I think it's probably tops about 7,000 years old, and that I get that from comparing genealogies in the Bible.
Dapper, I'll ask you the same question. How old do you think the Earth actually is?
So the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. If we're going to go to two significant figures, I usually only go to two significant figures for questions like that, and that is based on things like radiometric dating of both the Earth as well as other things in the solar system, such as asteroids, which would have formed, according to the nuclear hypothesis, at about the same time. It is true that the oldest rocks on Earth are basically all gone, so we do have to rely to some degree on that. But even if we didn't have that option, we still couldn't come up with an answer that's much less than 3 billion years old.
All right, thank you. Don Giovanni, Emperor of Harakan's been a member for a month, says, it's okay to be a believer and not a young Earth creationist. There are tons of ex-young Earth creationists that you could have a conversation with. Any response to that, Peter?
I mean, I have conversations with them all the time. I respect people like that. Yeah, I agree.
I would agree with Peter.
Yeah. Like I said, this is so refreshing to actually have. You've clearly got different position to Dapper and I, and probably most of our audiences, and Toon's audience as well. You hold a position a lot of us would consider stupid, really, in a lot of ways. But having a conversation with you is really refreshing and enjoyable. And you're clearly an intelligent and eloquent person, and it's
Thank you.
Peter, can you stop it? This is confusing.
We got to find out.
You're supposed to be shouting at me and calling me a retard and stuff. All right.
We have to find out what exactly it is about flat Earth that either attracts or creates just the most despicable people imaginable in ways that other things don't.
It's crazy. It really is crazy. Never before have I received so many death threats. Well, any death threats. Anything I've ever done. No one's ever sent me a death threat. Since I've been debunking flat Earth, I have received literally hundreds of death threats in my emails.
I've received one young Earth creationist death threat. One.
Signastep, $5 says, my question is, why is Craig such a jerk? It's actually in my contract. I have to be. I think it was 63% jerk. If I don't reach that threshold, I don't get my NASA bonus. Tobex became a member. Thank you. Welcome to Scrappers. Nugs Automation for $5 says, would belief in a 3 billion year Earth change your belief in Christianity?
No.
So if you came to the agreement that the Earth was in fact old, you would still believe that God is the creator, etc.
Well, yeah, because Jesus changed my heart, but it would throw me into confusion about his word and what all it says or doesn't say.
Okay. PhD Tony for $10 Australian. Thank you, Tony, only real man in the room. Also, your partner in debate against Nathan Thompson and Angel. How painful was that, by the way, for you? Speaking to Thompson and Angel.
Nathan Thompson and Angel, they're basically like two troubled kids in a classroom that they're like the unruly kids that always egg each other on. It was pretty obnoxious, especially when they like managed to make me slip up and say something that was on the screen that I didn't read, and then they were laughing at me, and that was annoying, but I got him back, so
no, you did very well. You savagely debunked them. Right, so Tony says radiometric dating, cosmogenic exposure ages, VARV/ice core /dendrochronology, electron spin resonance, optically /thermally stimulated luminescence, amino acid racemization. You're just
racemization.
Wrong, racemization. You're just wrong, Peter. Yeah.
Was that PhD Tony?
That was.
Yeah.
Yes.
So those are a list of various dating techniques, all of which are very easily able to get us past 7,000 years for the age of the Earth. Not all of them are going to get us to 3.5 billion, but they all get us past 7,000.
So dendrochronology is among those then. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have dendrochronology records that go back far enough to disprove young Earth creationism, as well as a few different floating ones that, when dated through other techniques, put them significantly older than young Earth creationism would allow for. But because they're floating, we don't have exact calendar dates for them like we do for other dendrochronological records.
Okay.
Any final thoughts on that one, Peter?
It didn't seem to be inviting thoughts, to be honest.
I mean, what I would say is perhaps think about why it is that there are multiple dating techniques that are causally independent, that all converge on similar dates for the age of things in the world, which are consistently older than you think the universe, than you think at least either Earth is or life on Earth is, despite themselves in many cases being biogenic.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I think previously, and when I was younger, I would have sort of just swept that into a category of like, oh, it's what was it, uh, universe. Shoot, I'm losing the word again. I'm so rusty at this. Versus catastrophism.
Uniformitarianism versus.
Yes, thank you. Uniformitarianism. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the problem is catastrophism isn't the magic wand that makes physics change.
No,
That's the problem.
Yeah,
and in
yeah.
order to use that as an excuse for overcoming these dating techniques, you would have to change physics, not just have a catastrophe. A catastrophe can explain things like, hey, why is there a really thick flood deposit here? Because of a catastrophe. Or, hey, why is there a really thick lava deposit here? Or an ash deposit? Or evidence of a landslide? What it can't do is tell you, hey, why are there 200,000 years worth of varves in this one formation? Catastrophes can't cover it because varves don't form in catastrophes. They only form in seasonal lakes that have seasonal deposits. And in fact, we can even tell they're seasonal because we can do things like measure the amount of pollen in them and even determine which species were emitting pollen at those times, which then we can use to correlate at which time of the year that varve was deposited. And we can say we have more varves than young Earth creationists say there are years in the entire world evident in just one formation. And we have many such formations. And because it involves life, we can't just go back with, well, maybe it's an old Earth but young life.
Okay.
Well. Okay.
Fair enough.
Dave D for $5 Australian, they're the upside down ones, says the Bible was an early attempt to establish a form of society and explain the world we lived in. Much has changed since 4,000 years ago. We have evolved. Any thoughts on that, Peter?
I mean, that's that. My answer is going to be obvious. Like that seems to be a worldview statement based in their worldview. I don't agree. Why would I agree with that?
Okay, no, that's fine. You don't have to agree with their view. I was just wondering on your thoughts on it. Anything to say on that one, Dapper?
My only thought is that be careful about attributing a single motive to, quote, the Bible, because remember, the Bible is a collection of texts written by different authors for different purposes. So you can't really say that the Bible was written to establish a society. It was written by people who were already living in a society, and it was written across different periods of time of that society as well as other societies. But generally speaking, I would say that at the very least, the texts that comprise most of the Torah were written primarily to help establish a ethnic identity for a largely displaced group of people who were in danger of losing their cultural heritage as a result of the hegemonic influence of a much larger empire, and that it has been fantastically successful at that task because that same group of people are an identifiable ethnicity with their own traditions that have persisted to this day. So good job, authors of at least the first bits of the Bible, because I would say you succeeded beyond your wildest dreams.
Yeah, it's the most famous book in the world, that's for sure. Signastep for $10 says, Craig, do 1,000 push-ups or you have to listen to Strawberry Switchblade for 4 hours straight. I am going to do 1,000 push-ups, even if it kills me on Monday. In my stream, 50% of all super chats will go to the military charity SAFA, who help veterans and serving people who need help with whatever they need help with. They're absolutely incredible. Helped me when I needed help moving house. JSS Tiger for $10 says, all religion stems for the need for there to be something better awaiting us after death. If we want there to be heaven, we can wish it into existence. Any thoughts on that, anybody?
I would say that it is actually probably not true because many religions don't actually have a firm idea about any kind of afterlife. In fact, it's not even clear in the Old Testament that when that was being written, there was much of an idea of an afterlife beyond sort of a kind of vague the grave. So I actually don't think that we can put fears about mortality as the cause for religion. I think it's more complex than that.
Peter?
Paul wrote in the Bible, or in the New Testament, that if Christ was not raised from the dead, and we are not raised, then Christians are of all men most to be pitied. And I would just echo that sentiment.
Okay, thank you.
That it's completely stupid to believe in something that's not true just because you want it to be true.
PhD Tony for $5 Australian. Thank you, Tony. The Bible says that Moses and Aaron won a magic contest against Pharaoh's sorcerers, who were described as doing magic. Does Peter believe in magic?
That depends on your definition of magic. It seems that PhD Tony is casting quite a broad net with that term. I believe in miracles, and I believe that there was something going on with Pharaoh's courtiers that, was presenting itself as magic. Exactly what that was, whether it was, something demonic, or whether it was just trickery, or a combination of the two, I don't know, but I do believe in the supernatural. I do believe, that the history recorded in that story is true, but I don't know how else to answer the question.
Okay, fair enough. Sigma Step for $2 says, I only said this halibut's good enough for Jehovah. Thank you, Sigma Step. The grumpy old mechanic, how is an enormously large and old universe incompatible with an infinite deity? I don't think anyone has made the claim that it is. Has anyone made the claim that
I
a
have
large
not.
and old universe is incompatible with infinite deity? I don't think you did, Peter, did you?
No, it's not incompatible.
No. I mean, if a deity is infinite, they can do whatever they want. So, I mean, they could make a large universe.
It's really a matter of exegesis. If you want to,
I learned what that word
hone
means
in on
today
the
because of
difference
you.
between...
You're using $10 words. Craig's a $5 word kind of guy.
Sorry. The main difference between theistic evolutionists and, someone like me, a young Earth creationist, it's not that somebody like me believes God isn't capable of using evolution or millions of years or whatever. That would be ridiculous. It's a matter of, does the Bible say that he did, or does it say something incompatible with that? So it's a matter of interpreting the Bible. That's what I mean by exegesis.
Okay. Thank you. All right. PhD Tony, $5 Australian, says cosmogenic nuclides in corals, varves, tree rings, and ice core layers agree exactly back to 13,000 years. Then we have another 850,000 ice core layers. How do you respond to the fact that we can date the ice and other things and see that it's older than you think the Earth is?
I don't know. I mean, this could go on forever with these types of very similar lines of reasoning. The result is going to be similar to what it was when I was discussing with Dapper Dino just a minute ago.
That's because there is essentially an infinite number of ways to know that young Earth creationism is wrong.
That's why that gives another couple of examples.
Because it contradicts all evidence that could be determinative between an old Earth and a young Earth, or young life and old life. Every single bit of evidence that could be determinative between those two favors science, the old Earth, evolution, all that stuff.
Tony goes on to say, with another super chat, $5, thank you. Oxygen and hydrogen isotopes ratios in ice cores agree closely with ocean core date for 850,000 years across 7 glacial cycles out of 150 glacial cycles. Then another $5 says ocean core data preserve records of 2 magnetic reversals out of many dozens of magnetic reversals we have records for. And another $5 says life must have existed 2.3 billion years ago to change Earth's atmosphere for the great oxygenation event to have occurred. Thoughts on any of those, Peter?
Well, when I was talking about there possibly being room for millions of years in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that was not me conceding ground to evolution or the grand narrative that all life descended from, microbial life and things like that. I still believe that's radically incompatible with the rest of Scripture, and also it's based in what seems to me like secular assumptions about the origins of the Earth and life. the text says God created the earth, and there's miracles happening every single day of the creation week. So, up to the end of the creation week, at the very least, I mean, kind of all bets are off as far as like us making assumptions about what was the origin of the atmosphere at that time or something. Like, it's just all kinds of assumptions are going into that statement that I don't agree with.
Okay. Any thoughts, Dapper?
Yeah, the assumptions that go into this are literally just the assumptions of science that Peter has already said that he is okay with. Basically, that the principles by which the universe operates do not vary based on time or space. Those are the assumptions. You have to add new assumptions in order to make that not be a valid inference. So, for instance, you have to add in the assumption that, well, maybe miracles occurred that would mean that, in fact, no. The principles according to which the universe operate are not consistent. And I can't stop you from doing it, but at the very least, you have to acknowledge that what you're doing at that point is the opposite of what science is.
Well, I think that the idea that the very beginning of the laws of science and the laws of physics and nature, the very beginning of those being a miracle, is just as logically and rationally valid as saying that it was something other than a miracle. Like,
okay, but no one's talking about the beginning of the laws of physics. These are events that would be happening long after any possible origin for the laws of physics. So if you want to push back the miraculous period to like the t=0 of the Big Bang, that is one thing, but that is not what you're doing. You're pushing that the possibility of these laws changing over 10 billion years, well, not quite over, but about 10 billion years past that point, and into the formation of Earth and the history of life on Earth. So if you want to say, well, the formation of the universe at t=0 and the laws of physics that came with it, that was a miraculous event, that's a different argument than saying we can count on miracles and it's not unscientific for an event that happened 3 billion years ago.
well, there's miracles that happen today. My wife was healed from cancer once. I believe it was a miracle that she was cured from cancer because the doctors could not explain it. She had a biopsy before and after. The doctors were baffled. She has a YouTube video about it. But Bible text obviously is not talking about that miracle. It's talking about miracles at the beginning of time when God was creating the earth and life on earth. So there's no clean cutoff point for saying, like, now, we're not allowed to invoke miracles anymore, and now we have to only invoke science. Like, God exists, in my belief, and is active in the world. So
and I'm not asking you not to believe that. All I am saying is that when you invoke those miracles, you are abandoning science in favor of something that is fundamentally not science.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah. that's
Okay.
probably correct.
Right, well, that's fine then. Walter Hugh Van Bellingham, member from 9 Months, says, the text is sacred. What you believe, Peter, is written by man, not God. So do you believe what farmers wrote all those years ago?
It was written by man in physical terms, but it was, I believe, inspired by God. I believe the Bible text bears signs of being transcendent above the human authorship. That's not really the topic of this conversation right now, per se.
Okay,
but
that's fine. Sergio Garcia Lavado, member for 1 month, says, literal Bible equals science denial equals conspiracy equals flat earth. I think he's just trying to make a link there between the kind of arguments that you make. And we've all kind of agreed that sometimes it can be flat earther-ish, the way that you have to argue for young earth creationism.
I at least think that you guys would agree, though, that I don't have to at any point say that any scientist who disagrees with me is intentionally lying or, being dishonest in their science or what they say to the rest of the population.
I don't think you think that, but I think that is possibly because you have not completely examined what would be required for the evidence to point in favor of young Earth creationism, because it would in fact require a vast conspiracy of almost every scientist in almost every field. Young Earth creationism is in fact a conspiracy theory when it's fully examined. The fact that not everyone has fully examined it to the point where they realize that that's the case, I don't think negates the fact that it is in fact a conspiracy theory.
Why on earth would I have to say that scientists are purposely lying?
Because otherwise
just
the
because-
evidence is conclusively contrary to young Earth creationism, to the point that it is physically precluded from being even a remote possibility. And the only other option, if you want to say that young Earth creationism is scientifically plausible, is for essentially all of the data published by virtually every scientist to be fabricated, which is a claim that essentially some creationists have made. For instance, when
I know some
Andrew
of them.
Snelling publishes things that are contrary to all the data that everyone else has found, either he's lying or they are. And so, yeah, young Earth creationism is in fact a conspiracy theory, because for it to be scientifically plausible, which is one of the claims that it makes, it would require virtually every scientist to be making up data.
See, there's you say things with so much stridence. It's sometimes difficult. Like, I don't believe that it's accurate to say that my belief is a conspiracy theory. Like I said,
because
I
you don't like
see...
conspiracy theories. But that's the problem.
No, I'm telling you that I
out.
don't believe any scientists are like lying on purpose that we can point to. Like,
I don't think you do believe that. What I am saying is that there are no other options when you have examined what it would actually require for young Earth creationism to be true. You're in a position where I don't think you have examined that in as much depth. Now, to be fair, look, doing that has basically been my job for like 3.5 years or something. So, you know, I've spent a lot of time working on that. And before it was a job, it was a pretty serious hobby of mine. So, like, I'm not expecting everyone to have as much background information about that as I do, but it is essentially inescapable. And when you get to creationists with PhDs who are talking about these topics, they often will say things that are conspiratorial. For instance, I've heard more than one creationist imply that radiometric dating is actually a conspiracy to get the dates that are desired by scientists on the part of the technicians running the labs.
Okay.
Literally proposing a conspiracy. Because otherwise, the labs are accurately reporting their information and it precludes a young Earth. So what else are you going to do? You have to say that if you're right, then the labs are lying to you. Because if they're not lying to you, then the Earth isn't young.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I have heard people say things like that. And that's one of the reasons why I was saying, you know, I'm learning what not to do from flat earthers. You know, when I was 13, I might have been like, well, yeah, they are lying, you know, or something like that. But
I mean, hey, maybe they are. That is something you could find out if they are. I mean, there are ways to check.
But there's, I mean, yeah. Let's move on.
Next one is from JSS Tiger. A question for you, Peter, for $5. Would you believe in God if the Bible was entirely written today? Interesting.
What?
I guess
if it was entirely written today, I don't even know what that means.
I mean, like if there had been no Bible yesterday, but then today someone published the Bible and now you had it. How would that make you feel?
No, of course not.
God?
That would be ridiculous. I mean, it's rooted in history. There's so much about it that's historical. It has to be. If it's not historical, if it's just fiction, then like I go back to what I said earlier about, you know, Paul saying if the dead are not raised, then what's the point? We're just believing a lie.
Okay, fair enough. PhD Tony, $5 Australian. Thank you, Tony, again. Interstellar dust from the Murchison meteorite has been dated to 7 billion years old. Why is that dust older than the Earth?
Well, there... hold on. There's complexities to that I'm trying to get a handle on. So he's saying it's not about the light traveling. It's about, what we're observing of the light that is reaching us right now.
No, that's the physical dust that we now have on Earth.
Oh,
It's from
physical
this
dust
meteor.
on Earth. Oh,
Right.
okay.
Yeah,
The light isn't a factor
Yeah,
here.
yeah. This is a meteorite that came from outside
I
of our solar
misunderstood that.
system,
Okay.
and we have collected some of the dust from it and sampled it and figured out that it's older than 7 billion years.
Okay. I mean, I don't really understand the process to arrive at that conclusion.
It's fine.
I don't even know if I can answer the question.
Okay, maybe something to look into. Electric IPM, $5 Canadian, thank you. Peter, where does your trust in the Bible stem from? Is it just faith?
Well, I mean, it's a combination of things. Obviously, faith is a large element. It's also that I have made a lifelong study of the Bible, and I believe that it is a supernatural text. I see what appears to me to be a supernatural harmony in the text, and I know there's people who are going to say, "Well, this is full of contradictions." Whatever. I don't agree. Having read it many times, I don't see. Most of the things that people say are contradictions when studied fairly. I don't think they are contradictions, and it's simply a matter of like the gospel, especially the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we are deserving of death, but God loves us and decided to send his son to be sacrificed for us and to pardon us and to invite us back into harmony with him. I believe that has transcendent virtue. That humans couldn't have come up with that. It's too beautiful, if I can be frank. That's why I believe. So yes, that is faith, but I believe it's reasonable faith. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think it does. All right, we move on. Icy Spin 199 says, "Did ERVs or the heat problem come up yet?" Yes, you guys did talk about that, didn't you?
We did talk about the heat problem. I don't think we talked about ERVs.
Do you want to mention anything?
I mean, if we wanted to have a discussion about ERVs, so ERVs are endogenous retroviruses. Basically, there's this group of viruses called retroviruses, and they use a protein called reverse transcriptase to take some of their genetic data and put it into a spot in a host genome. And then when the host transcribes that section of the genome, it will then hijack the cellular machinery of the host to produce new viral capsules, which will then, burst out of the host if all goes well for the virus. However, sometimes a retrovirus will infect a germline cell, which means it will make it into the, descendants of that organism, and the virus will be deactivated, whether it be because of an error in the reverse transcription or because of various defense mechanisms that the host cell has, because host cells do have, defenses against retroviral infection. And when that happens, the descendants will have that retroviral genome at a particular place in their genome and will pass that down to their descendants. And it turns out that the chances of any retrovirus infecting any given spot in a particular genome is wildly improbable. And so you can use shared retroviral insertions that are endogenous, which is why it's passed down from, parent to offspring, to determine relatedness. Because if two organisms share a common retroviral insertion at a particular place in the genome, the only plausible explanation for that is that was inserted in that spot in the germline of one of their ancestors. And it turns out that humans share ERVs with chimpanzees and bonobos that they do not share with any other organisms, and with gorillas and chimps and bonobos that they do not share outside of that. And it goes the whole way through, which is, in my book, extremely compelling evidence, because it is hard to see how that could happen in any way other than the actual infection of an actual common ancestor, or, I suppose, a deceitful creator.
Any thoughts on that, Peter?
Well, I have a question, actually. Do you know, Dapper, like what the average length of one of these retroviral insertions are in terms of like nucleotide bases?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it is an entire viral genome, so it's going to be constrained by the minimal viral genome length, which is going to be at least in the few thousands of base pairs.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think personally that seems to me to rise to the level of definite, deceit on God's part if he were to create two organisms with a matching set in their genome like that. Similar to what I was saying about the tree rings, I suppose.
It seems
But
like
that's-
there's no actual real world example that you do think might rise to that level, and I find that to be convenient for you intellectually. Because to me, that seems like an extremely egregious amount of dishonesty for a creator that would be unconscionable for anything that you might be calling a honest or moral creator. But you seem to be willing to accept virtually any amount of indication of false history, basically by just saying, well, I don't think that's big enough. And it, to me, starts to feel like there is no amount of evident but fictional history that God could place in the universe before you would say, that seems like a deceitful act. It seems like you're basically just becoming intellectually equivalent of last Thursdayism, which just says the universe was actually created last Thursday by God, and literally everything that would indicate otherwise, including your own memories, is part of the age that God simply gave to the universe last Thursday in order to make it seem like
I understand that
well-lived in universe.
I mean, the example that I gave earlier of something that would rise to the level of dishonesty on God's part would be like an image of a star exploding far away. That's something that happens in the real world. So
I don't see how this is different. Those are both evidence of an event that happened in the past that are equally, like, they're both just things that had to have happened physically in the past. And if they didn't actually happen in the past, but God is giving us every indication that they did, I don't see how there's a difference there. Sure, one might be easier to observe than the other, but both are equally indicative of an event that had to have happened in the past. And if that event didn't happen, then God's lying about it.
No, I don't agree that those are equal, because in the case of the retrovirus insertion, like you're I mean, I'm not saying that is what that I'm trying to be careful. It's a matter of interpreting, like
there's not that much interpretation. We know what viral genomes look like. In one case, because this is a retrovirus, an important one is the gene for reverse transcriptase. We know what the sequence for that gene is within, the tolerances that allow it to function as reverse transcriptase. There's no reason for a non-retroviral genome to have a protein that takes a genetic sequence and copies it back into the DNA, because cellular organisms try their best to avoid doing that, because that causes problems for them. So your DNA is set to try to avoid having sequences that aren't already in the genome read back into it. It takes a specific protein. The only reason that cellular life has reverse transcriptase genes that are now broken and coded in their genome is because of viral insertions. There is no other plausible option for that. We see it happen now. There's every indication that that's how it happened in the past. And if you want to say that humans were just coincidentally created with useless viral genomes in their genome, in the same spot as a chimpanzee that is identical to a now degraded retroviral genome, there's no conclusion other than that either God just put something in there that's non-functional and looks exactly like what we would expect if there had been human-chimpanzee common ancestry, and he just kind of did that. Or the other option is that's actually what happened. And if God just kind of did that, I can't see how that isn't dishonest, because it gives every indication of an actual history of common ancestry. In fact, there are no other options that aren't magic that involve that evidence.
But see, every miracle that I've cited is something that you would call magic.
Right.
I mean,
I'm not going to distinguish between those two things, because to me, magic are things that are not examinable by the scientific method because they violate one of the orderly principles according to which the universe normally operates. And so I'm going to use those interchangeably. But that's the thing. If it's a miracle that otherwise would indicate a false history to the world, that is what I would call a dishonest act by God. And the star
But-
is dishonest for that very reason.
But
Because
then
it
you,
indicates a history
final
that did
on
not
this one
literally
from
happen.
Peter, and then we move on to the next question.
Okay. Yeah, take the final word, Peter.
it seems to me like you have then epistemologically categorized creationism by definition as dishonesty on God's part, because you interpret the existence of life as history.
No, remember back to earlier when I said that it is the unnecessary. There might be
Yes.
some amounts of creation that are simply necessary for it to be functional, and if it's minimally that, then no, I don't think that's dishonest.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, I
and-
just took
so-
the last. I took the word. My bad.
It's okay. Right. Right. Move on. Left-handed Jedi for $5 says, "What are your thoughts on the similarities between the Bible and Sumerian myths, Peter?"
I haven't studied Sumerian myth beyond just checking to make sure that indeed it is not a Robothemist flat Earth model. That's the extent of my study of Sumerian myth, so I probably shouldn't open my mouth on the subject, to be honest.
Fair enough. PJ for $20 says, "Just because Craig needs a new camera, thank you. I have a new camera on order, so I very much appreciate it. It was very expensive, like $350. So if anyone wants to help with the cost of that, feel free. I need you to see my beautifulness." Is that even a word? Yeah. Icy Spin 199 says, "If God is perfect, why does Darth Dawkins exist?" Yeah, no, that's a question we all ask every day. Don't worry. Dihydrogen Monoxide for £2 says, "Dapper's 100+ million year age disproves young Earth creationism." Well, yeah. Exactly how old are you, Dapper? So, roughly, because you don't have the exact date.
It's roughly 150 million years. The exact past that is hard to determine. Although I do believe that planetary scientist Landon Knoll did work on figuring it out a few years ago for one of my birthday specials. So if you look back at like I think it's like 2022 birthday special or something, maybe Landon is there giving you what he thinks is an even closer estimate for my exact age.
You mean you don't remember?
Well, so I was hatched before the current calendar existed. So it's hard to correlate them, and also the length of the year in terms of days was different because the Earth was spinning faster back then. So it's very hard to keep track.
Gotcha.
Also, my original environment was not nearly as seasonal as much of the Earth is now because it was basically a relatively hot and arid location year-round. So we didn't do as much keeping track of the year.
So what did you think when you saw these weird, like, hairless apes running around all of a sudden?
Honestly, it's hard to tell you apart from all the other mammals. You all look really similar.
Well, that's a bit...
You've all got,
rude.
like, weirdly shaped teeth and...
Yeah, it says the giant chicken. PhD Tony for $5 Australian. "The Bible was divinely inspired, but decided to leave rape and slavery out of the Ten Commandments." Well, that's a bit of a controversial one.
That's not outside of the Ten Commandments. I mean, rape is definitely under the category of adultery, and slavery is under the category of stealing something that's not yours, or coveting something that's not yours.
I would have to disagree. For one thing, the idea that that rape is included that way does preclude the idea of marital rape, which I would rather not preclude because I think that that is definitely a category of rape that exists. As far as slavery, the Bible goes on to condone and regulate slavery. If the Bible were opposed to slavery, it would not do that. Now, you can argue that it's opposed to certain forms of slavery, and I would agree it is. It does not give you carte blanche to do any kind of slavery that you would want. But nowhere in the Bible is there even a syllable that would indicate that slavery is something that people ought not to do in principle.
Yeah, I guess I was a little sloppy with my categories there. I was trying to apply the general principle. The Ten Commandments cover a lot more than people typically assume. If we just look at the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, he said, if you look at a woman to lust after her, then you've already committed adultery in your heart. Or if you hate your brother, you've already committed murder in your heart. So, be careful saying things aren't covered in the Ten Commandments. They might just be.
Okay, Icy Spin 199, thank you very much, says, "Hardest thing for me is the logical problem of evil." Yeah, this is something that I've discussed with many theists, is, how can God be good if evil exists? But that is a big bag to unpack, so we're not going to do that here. Although I am looking to debate somebody on that particular question on modern day debates. Alejandro Vallejo for 50 Mexican dollars says, Peter, how can you know the Bible is not an attempt of Satan to mislead you and God gave us science and reason to figure out the deception?
Okay, I mean, what's the evidence for that?
I don't know, it's just a hypothetical.
I mean, I would say the evidence is the degree to which people who count on the Bible being literally true in its historical narrative can now then just ignore the actual historical and physical evidence that indicate that it is, in some cases, although not all, not in fact literally true in its historical narrative, and that therefore those people are being deceived by something. And if you want to say that Satan is the father of lies, then at least that's a plausible interpretation. I don't actually happen to think that, but at least that's a line of reasoning that I do think would be worth consideration for anyone who does believe that the Bible gives an accurate account entirely of its historical narrative. Because, I mean, it just demonstrably doesn't in some cases. There are other cases where it does actually seem to be reasonably accurate, but it's really not until we get to, like, Josiah and later that we seem to be getting a whole lot of reliable historical information.
Right. Well, that was an interesting question. Last question from JSS Tiger for $5. Thank you very much for the support, everybody. He says, Peter, why is Exodus missing from the Egyptian record? It's the biggest event in the Old Testament.
That's a fair question, but I mean, they were essentially a humiliated nation. Their whole system of government collapsed because, you know, Pharaoh was drowned in the Red Sea after essentially becoming suicidally manic. Also, the 10 plagues kind of devastated their economy. Why would they record that? Like, that's
I mean,
any more than, you know, we know there was a decline in their kingdom at a certain point. That seems as much of a corollary record as there can be, as you can expect there to be, in my mind.
Okay, right. We're going to stop it there because Dapper has a show soon. I have another show with MC Toon in about 15 minutes. And it's been going for over 2 hours.
It's just a game. I'm not actually going live.
Right, okay.
I don't want anyone to go looking for me. I'm not actually broadcasting this. It's just a game.
Broadcast. We all want to see it. So I want to thank both of you, Peter and Dapper, for coming to have this discussion. I very much enjoyed it. It's nice to not have to deal with shouting children whilst, you know, doing a debate or discussion. So that is wonderful. I'm going to end the Zoom call now and kick you both off as I finish the stream. Thank you very much for the pair of you, and speak to you both soon.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
No worries, you're both welcome. I really enjoyed it. See you soon, guys. Bye-bye.
Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Thurrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elron Teller, Ian Chen, Calvin Brostick von Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Edwin M., North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.